Some people choose their dogs, and some dogs choose their people. The Pengelly family had no say in the choosing of Lob. It began on the beach, the summer when Sandy was 5, Don, her brother, 12, and the twins were 3. Sandy was short for Alexandra. On this summer day, she was lying peacefully, reading a comic. Father, Bert Pengelly, and Don were up on the hard, painting the bottom boards of the boat in which Father went fishing, and Mother, Jean Pengelly, was making puddings. Little did they guess how soon this state of things would be changed by the large new member who was going to erupt into their midst. Sandy rolled onto her back to make sure that the twins were not climbing on slippery rocks. At the same moment, a large body struck her forcibly in the midriff, and she was covered by flying sand. Instinctively, she shut her eyes and felt the sand being wiped off her face by something that seemed like a warm, rough, damp flannel. She opened her eyes and looked. It was a tongue. Its owner was a large and bouncy young Alsatian, or German shepherd, with topaz eyes, black-tipped prick ears, a thick, soft coat, and a bushy black-tipped tail. "Lob!" shouted a man. "Lob, come here!" His owner, a grey-haired man with a limp, walked over as quickly as he could and seized him by the collar. "I hope he didn't give you a fright," the man said to Sandy. "He meant it in play. He's only young." "Oh no, I think he's beautiful," said Sandy. She picked up a bit of driftwood and threw it. Lob went after it like a sand-colored bullet and came back with the stick and gave it to Sandy. For Sandy, too, it was love at first sight. And when she and the twins joined Father and Don to go home for tea, they cast many a backward glance at Lob, being led away by his master. "I wish we could play with him every day," Tess sighed. "Why can't we?" said Tim. Sandy explained. "Because Mr. Dodsworth, who owns him, is from Liverpool, and he is only staying at the Fisherman's Arms till Saturday." It was a Cornish fishing village where the Pengelly family lived, with rocks and cliffs and a strip of beach and a little round harbour, and palm trees growing in the gardens of the little whitewashed stone houses. The village was approached by a narrow, steep, twisting hill road, and guarded by a notice that said, "Low gear for 1.5 miles, dangerous to cyclists." The Pengelly children went home, thinking they had seen the last of Lob. But they were much mistaken. The whole family was playing cards by the fire in the front room after supper, when there was a loud thump and a crash of china in the kitchen. "My Christmas puddings!" exclaimed Jean and ran out. It was Lob, who had bounced in through the open kitchen window. Lob stood on his hind legs and plastered Sandy's face with licks. Then he did the same for the twins, who shrieked with joy. "Where does this friend of yours come from?" inquired Mr. Pengelly. "He's staying at the Fisherman's Arms. I mean, his owner is. Then he must go back there. Find a bit of string, Sandy, to tie to his collar." "I wonder how he found his way here," Mrs. Pengelly said. Sandy explained about their afternoon's game on the beach. Lob's owner thanked Mr. Pengelly for bringing him back. Jean Pengelly warned the children that they had better not encourage Lob any more. The next day was Saturday. Sandy had found out that Mr. Dodsworth was to catch the 9:30 train. She went out secretly, down to the station. She saw Mr. Dodsworth get on the train, accompanied by an unhappy-looking Lob with drooping ears and tail. Then she saw the train slide away. Sandy walked home miserably. A week passed. Then One evening, suddenly, history was repeating itself. There was a crash from the kitchen. Jean Pengelly leaped up, but Sandy was ahead of her mother. With eyes like stars, she had darted into the kitchen, where she and Lob were hugging one another in a frenzy of joy. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Jean. "How in the world did he get here?" "He must have walked," said Sandy. "Look at his feet." They were worn and dusty. One had a cut on the pad. "They ought to be bathed," said Jean Pengelly. "Sandy, run a bowl of warm water while I get the disinfectant. Your dad can get the address from the fishermen's tomorrow. In the meantime, he'd better have a long drink and a good meal." Lob was very grateful for the meal and having his feet washed. Then he flopped down on the hearthrug and slept with his head on Sandy's feet. He had walked all the way from Liverpool to Cornwall, which is more than 400 miles. The next day, Lob's owner, Dodsworth, arrived to take his pet home. That parting was worse than the first. Lob whined, Don walked out of the house, the twins burst out crying, and Sandy crept up to her bedroom and lay feeling as if she were bruised all over. Jean Pengelly took them all into Plymouth to see the circus on the next day, and the twins cheered up a little, but nothing could cure Sandy's sore heart. In 10 days' time, Lob was back, limping this time, with a torn ear and a patch missing out of his furry coat, as if he had met and tangled with an enemy or two in the course of his 400-mile walk. Bert Pengelly rang up Liverpool again. Mr. Dodsworth said, "I can't spare away from my work, plus endless time in police stations and drafting newspaper advertisements. I'm too old for these ups and downs. I think, Mr. Pengelly, that it's your family he wants to stay with. You may have him as a gift." Alexandra's father looked at his daughter's swimming eyes. "Well then, Mr. Dodsworth," he said briskly, "we'll be overjoyed, and you can be sure Lob has come to a good home." So that was how Lob came to live with the Pengelly family. Everybody loved him, and he loved them all. But he was Sandy's dog. He slept by her bed and followed her everywhere. 9 years went by. In the course of 9 years, Lob changed less than Sandy. As she went into her teens, he became a little slower, a little stiffer. There was a touch of grey on his nose, but he was still a handsome dog. He and Sandy still loved one another devotedly. One evening in October, it was a wet, windy dusk. When the children came home from school, Jean Pengelly said, "Sandy, your Aunt Rebecca says she's lonesome because Uncle Will Hoskins has gone out trawling, and she wants you to go and spend the evening with her. Can I take Lob with me? You know Aunt Becky doesn't really like dogs, but I suppose she'll have to put up with him." Mrs. Pengelly sighed. Sandy fastened Lob's lead to his collar and set off to Aunt Becky's cottage, which was 5 minutes' climb up the steep hill. The wind was howling through the shrouds of boats drawn up on the hard. "Put some cheerful music on," said Jean Pengelly to the nearest twin. Don put on some rock music, loud, which was why the Pengellys did not hear the truck hurtle down the hill and crash against the post office wall a few minutes later. Dr. Travers was driving through Cornwall with his wife. He saw the sign that said, "Steep Hill, low gear for 1.5 miles, dangerous to cyclists." Dutifully, he changed into second gear. "I noticed a sign on the coast road that said the Fisherman's Arms was 2 miles, said his wife, Emily. "What a narrow, dangerous hill! Oh, Frank, stop! There's a child! by the wall over there." Dr. Travers jammed on his brakes. A little stream ran down by the road, and half in the water lay something that looked, in the dusk, like a pile of clothes. Mrs. Travers was out of the car in a flash, but her husband was quicker. "She's been hit. Can't be more than a few minutes. Remember that truck that overtook us half a mile back, speeding like the devil? Quick, phone for an ambulance. The girl's in a bad way." "I'll stay here and stop the bleeding," he said sharply. Dr. Travers was able to stop the bleeding, but the girl was lying in a queerly crumpled heap, and he guessed she had a number of bones broken. Mrs. Travers was very quick, and in a few minutes, an ambulance was wailing down the hill. It lifted the child, and they sped off to Plymouth, and Dr. Travers went down to the police station to report. At 9:30 that night, Aunt Rebecca Hoskins was sitting by her fire when she was startled by a neighbor who burst in, exclaiming, "Have you heard about Sandy Pengelly? Poor little soul, and they don't know if she's likely to live. Police have got the truck driver." Horrified, Aunt Rebecca went down to her brother's house. She found the family with white, shocked faces. Bert and Jean were about to drive off to the hospital where Sandy had been taken, and the twins were crying bitterly. Lob was nowhere to be seen. "Oh, if only I'd never invited the poor child," wailed Mrs. Hoskins. That night seemed to last forever. The twins cried themselves to sleep. Dawn came home very late. Bert and Jean sat in the waiting room of the Western Counties Hospital, but Sandy was unconscious, and there was no Lob. At noon next day, Dr. and Mrs. Travers went to the Pengelly cottage to inquire how Sandy was doing, but the report was gloomy.
"Still in a very serious condition."
The Western Counties Hospital is a large one, but by that afternoon, it became noticeable that a dog seemed to have taken up position outside the hospital, with the fixed intention of getting in. Sometimes he would get a little way inside, but firmly turned out again. Sometimes the guard at the main entrance offered him a bit of sandwich, but he never ate the sandwich. At tea time, Granny Pierce came through the pouring rain to bring a flask of hot tea to her daughter and son-in-law. "Why, bless me!" exclaimed old Mrs. Pierce. "That's Lob! Here, Lob, Lobby boy!" Lob ran to her, whining. "I'm sorry, madam, you can't bring that dog in here," the guard said. Mrs. Pierce was a very determined old lady. "Now see here, young man. That dog has walked 20 miles from St. Killen to get to my granddaughter, and he ought to have his rights. He ought to get to see her. Do you know," she went on, bristling, "that dog has walked the length of England twice to be with that girl? And you think you can keep him out with your fiddling rules and regulations?" Finally, the medical officer relented. "It's strictly against every rule, but as it's such a serious case, we are making an exception," he said to her quietly, but only for a moment or two. Without a word, Lob followed Granny Pierce. They walked to Sandy's room. Bert and Jean were inside. Everything was terribly quiet. There was a narrow bed with a lot of gadgets around it. Sandy lay there, very still. All Lob's attention was riveted on the bed. Lob let out a faint whine, anxious and pleading. At the sound of that whine, Sandy stirred just a little. She sighed. Her eyes opened, looking at the door. "Lob?" she murmured. "Lobby boy?" Sandy moved her left arm, the one that was not broken, and let her hand dangle down, as she always did in the mornings, for Lob's furry head. Granny Pierce and Lob moved to the bedside. She looked at the smile on her granddaughter's face as the groping fingers found Lob's wet ears and gently pulled them. "Good boy," whispered Sandy, and fell asleep again. Granny Pierce led Lob out into the passage again. There he ran off swiftly down the stairs. Bert and Jean had come out into the passage. "Listen, Mother," said Bert. "Lob was killed by the same truck that hit Sandy. Dawn found him. He was dead." Slowly, old Mrs. Pierce, and then the other two, turned to look at the trail of dripping wet footprints that led down the hospital stairs. In the Pengelly's garden, they have a stone under the palm tree. It says, "Lob, Sandy's dog, buried at sea."